Most people think the moment begins when they notice the bird, but that isn't really how it happens. The real moment usually starts earlier, in the middle of something ordinary. A quiet morning. A half-finished cup of coffee cooling beside the kitchen sink. The soft hum of the refrigerator filling the silence while the rest of the house still feels asleep. Maybe rain passed through overnight because the wooden fence outside looks darker than usual, the grass wet enough to catch the pale gray light spreading slowly across the yard. You step outside without thinking much about it. Just another morning. Just another breath of cold air settling into your chest. And then something makes you stop. Not a sound. The absence of one. The feeling arrives first. That strange instinct people almost always ignore. Like your body noticed something a few seconds before your mind could explain it. There's a crow sitting on the fence post near the corner of the yard. Completely still. Its feathers barely moving in the wind. Most birds scatter the second a door opens. This one doesn't. It watches you instead. Not in the casual way birds usually look around. Not a quick movement. Not curiosity. This feels focused. Direct. You shift your weight slightly against the wooden step and the crow tilts its head almost imperceptibly, like it's studying something beneath the surface of you. The strange part is how long it holds the stare. 5 seconds. Maybe 10. Long enough for the moment to stop feeling normal. Somewhere down the street, tires hiss softly over wet pavement. A dog barks once and then goes quiet again. But inside the yard itself, everything feels unusually still, like the morning is waiting for something. If you're new here, subscribe before you leave, because what you're about to learn may change the way you look at every bird that has ever stopped and watched you for just a little too long. And the unsettling thing is this wasn't random. Because what happened next is where people begin realizing the stare itself may not be the important part. The important part is what the bird seemed to notice before you did. You have probably felt this before and never talked about it out loud. A moment so small it would sound strange if you tried explaining it to someone else. A bird looking at you just a little too long. Not enough to frighten you. Just enough to stay in your mind afterward while you went through the rest of your day pretending it meant nothing. Most people do that. They laugh it off almost immediately. They tell themselves the bird was only curious, only waiting for food, only reacting to movement. And maybe part of that is true. But the reason moments like this stay with people has very little to do with logic. It is because something deeper reacts before explanation has time to arrive. You can feel it in your body when it happens. That strange pause. The way your thoughts suddenly become quieter for a second. The way the world around you sharpens. The distant sound of wind moving through trees. The creak of a fence post settling in the cold. Even the rhythm of your own breathing starts to feel more noticeable. It is almost like your nervous system recognizes the moment before your conscious mind does. And the unsettling thing is how personal it feels. Because the crow was not watching the yard. It was watching you specifically. The angle of your face. The way you stood there without moving. The stillness you carried that morning without fully realizing it yourself. And this is where things begin to shift in ways most people never expect. Because what researchers slowly started discovering about crows over the last several decades suggests these moments may not be nearly as random as they first appear. For a long time, scientists believed most birds reacted to humans in simple ways. Movement meant danger. Food meant safety. Nothing more complicated than that. But crows kept disrupting that assumption in ways researchers could not easily explain. In one study, people wore different masks while walking through a public park where crows nested high above the trees. One mask was associated with a stressful encounter. The other was harmless. Months later, sometimes years later, the crows still recognized the threatening face immediately even when the clothing changed, even when the person walked differently, even when the season itself had changed around them. But the stranger part was this. The birds began teaching other crows too. Young birds that had never seen the original encounter still reacted the moment that same face appeared beneath the trees. Which means somewhere above the ordinary noise of everyday life. These birds were watching, remembering, categorizing. Quietly building an understanding of specific humans over time. And once you sit with that long enough, something begins to feel different about those moments in your own yard. The crow on the fence no longer feels random in the same way. You start noticing details you ignored before. How it always seemed to face directly toward you instead of toward the feeder. How its eyes stayed fixed even when a truck rolled slowly past the house. How it arrived before you stepped outside some mornings, already waiting near the corner of the fence line, as if it somehow anticipated your routine before it happened. But this is where things become even more difficult to dismiss. Because researchers eventually realized crows were not only recognizing faces, they were responding to emotional patterns too. What surprised researchers most was not that crows remembered people. It was how precisely they responded to emotional behavior once recognition had already formed. Calm movements changed the distance they tolerated. Hesitation changed the way they watched. Repeated emotional states created repeated behavioral responses. Over time, the birds began reacting differently not just to who a person was, but to how that person carried themselves through the world. And once you understand that, certain moments suddenly feel far less imaginary. Because maybe you have noticed it too. The crow appearing more often during periods when your mind felt heavy and overcrowded. During mornings when sleep never really came. During evenings when you sat in your car an extra few minutes after pulling into the driveway, because going inside somehow felt harder than usual. The strange thing is that animals often respond first to changes humans barely admit to themselves. Researchers studying mammalian behavior have documented measurable reactions to altered breathing patterns, posture shifts, eye movement, and tension carried in the body long before spoken communication ever happens. Crows seem unusually sensitive to these subtle signals. Their survival depends on it. A crow can assess threat level in seconds simply by watching the rhythm of another creature's movement. Fast hands, sudden turns, restless pacing, or the opposite, stillness, slowed motion. The quiet withdrawal people carry when something inside them feels unresolved. Standing there in the pale morning light beside the damp grass and dark fence boards, you begin realizing the bird may not have been reacting to your face alone. It may have been responding to something older and quieter beneath it. And this is where the feeling changes completely. Because the longer the pattern continued, the harder it became to believe the crow was only observing your actions. It almost felt like it was noticing the parts of you that never reached words. After that morning, you started noticing the bird everywhere. Not dramatically. Not in the kind of way movies try to make mysterious things happen. It was quieter than that. Smaller. The kind of repetition most people would miss unless they were already paying attention. Some mornings it waited on the same fence post before the sun fully cleared the rooftops. Other times it stood in the maple tree near the driveway. Feathers puffed slightly against the cold while the neighborhood still looked half asleep beneath the pale blue light. And each time you stepped outside, there was that same pause. That same strange stillness passing between you. Eventually your body began reacting before your thoughts did. You stopped reaching for your phone when you walked outside. You moved more slowly without realizing it. Sometimes you stood there with one hand wrapped around a warm coffee mug while thin ribbons of steam drifted upward into the morning air, and the crow simply watched from a few yards away like this had become part of both your routines. The unsettling thing was how natural it started to feel. You began looking toward the fence before opening the door, listening for the rough low call somewhere beyond the trees. And on the mornings it was not there, the yard somehow felt emptier than it should have. That is the part people rarely admit out loud. The attachment forms quietly, not because the bird belongs to you, but because repetition creates recognition, and recognition creates emotional weight. Over time, the crow no longer felt like part of the background scenery outside your house. It felt aware of you in a way that was difficult to explain without sounding irrational. But what happened next made the feeling much harder to dismiss, because the bird began appearing during moments that felt far too specific to be coincidence. It stopped feeling like a simple encounter sometime around the third week. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because the timing became strangely precise. The crow appeared during moments when the noise inside your mind felt loudest and the world around you felt unusually distant. One late afternoon you sat alone in your car after work while rain tapped softly against the windshield in uneven patterns. The engine was off. The streetlights had just begun flickering on across the neighborhood, casting long amber reflections over the wet pavement. You were not thinking about birds at all. In fact, you were trying not to think about anything. And then movement crossed the edge of the glass. The crow landed on the hood of the car, so lightly you barely heard it. Just the faint scrape of claws against metal. It stood there inches beyond the windshield, black feathers shining blue at the edges beneath the parking lot lights. And again, that stare. Calm. Unbroken. Not aggressive. Somehow worse than aggression because it felt aware. You noticed your breathing slow without meaning to. The tension in your shoulders loosened slightly. Outside, everything else kept moving normally. Cars passed. Wind pushed dead leaves along the curb. Somewhere in the distance, a siren faded through the darkening streets. But inside that small moment, time felt strangely suspended. And this is what so many people quietly describe when they talk about experiences like this. Not fear. Recognition. As if the bird is responding to an emotional frequency humans themselves barely understand. Some people spend years ignoring their intuition until something external reflects it back at them. A recurring number. A sudden silence. An animal that appears at impossible moments. But the unsettling part was not that the crow kept showing up. It was that deep down, before each appearance, some part of you had already started expecting it. After a while, the experience stopped feeling isolated and began feeling connected to something larger and harder to explain. You started noticing how many people quietly carried stories like this without ever fully understanding why they stayed with them for years. A bird appearing during grief, during loneliness, during moments of uncertainty when life seemed to narrow into silence and routine. Many people believe animals respond to emotional energy in ways humans have forgotten how to notice. Not magic exactly. Something older than that. Something instinctive. Indigenous traditions across North America often described crows as observers standing between worlds, creatures deeply connected to memory, transition, and hidden awareness. Even now, researchers studying animal cognition admit there is still much they do not fully understand about how certain species interpret emotional behavior in humans. And something about that feels difficult to ignore once you have experienced it yourself. Because the crow never approached during loud, crowded moments. Never during distraction. It appeared in stillness. In quiet emotional spaces where your thoughts became impossible to outrun. One morning you found yourself standing in the backyard before sunrise watching fog drift low across the grass in thin silver layers. The neighborhood was almost completely silent except for the distant hum of a passing truck somewhere beyond the trees. And there it was again, perched on the same fence post. Waiting. Not moving. In the dim blue light, its eyes reflected just enough to catch your attention before the rest of the bird fully emerged from the shadows. You stood there longer than usual that morning. Not because you were trying to understand the crow anymore, but because something about the repeated encounter had begun turning your attention inward instead. And that may be the strangest part of experiences like this. Sometimes the animal itself is not the message. Sometimes it simply becomes the thing that finally slows you down enough to hear your own intuition speaking underneath the noise. By then, the mornings had changed in ways that were almost impossible to measure from the outside. The yard itself looked the same. The same weathered fence boards silvered by years of rain. The same maple branches shifting softly whenever the wind moved through them. The same distant sounds of sprinklers starting up across neighboring lawns before sunrise. But inside those quiet moments, something felt slower now. More deliberate. You no longer rushed through the silence the way most people do. Some mornings you simply stood there listening to the faint rustling of leaves overhead, while cold air settled against your skin and the first light spread carefully across the grass. And somewhere nearby, the crow watched from its familiar place without demanding anything from you at all. That was the part that stayed with you most. The absence of force. The bird never tried to approach closer than necessary. Never performed some impossible act that would have shattered the realism of the moment. It only appeared. Again and again. Calm enough that eventually the experience stopped feeling frightening and started feeling strangely comforting instead. Like the world itself had become slightly more aware than you once believed it was. There are moments in life when people become so distracted by noise, schedules, and constant movement that they stop listening to the quieter instincts underneath everything else. But standing there in the soft blue light of early morning, with the neighborhood still half asleep and the crow motionless against the fading darkness, you began realizing intuition rarely arrives loudly. It does not force itself into your life. It waits patiently in silence until something finally makes you still enough to notice it. And sometimes, unexpectedly, that reminder arrives with feathers, dark eyes, and a gaze that seems to look a little farther into you than logic can comfortably explain. The strange thing is that eventually the crows stopped appearing every single morning. There was no dramatic ending to it. No final sign. No impossible event meant to answer every question cleanly. 1 week passed where you only saw it twice. Then once. Then not at all. And somehow that silence carried its own weight. The fence post remained empty beneath the pale morning sky, while cold wind moved softly through the branches overhead. The grass still gathered silver drops of dew before sunrise. The neighborhood still woke slowly in the distance with the low rumble of garage doors and sprinklers clicking on across nearby lawns. Everything looked exactly the same, and yet something inside you had shifted permanently. Because the real change was never the bird. It was the way you began moving through the world afterward. More aware of quiet moments. More attentive to instincts you used to dismiss immediately. You started noticing how often life tries to speak in subtle ways long before it ever becomes loud enough to force our attention. Through patterns. Through silence. Through the feeling that certain moments carry more emotional weight than logic alone can explain. Many people spend their entire lives disconnected from that deeper part of themselves, constantly overriding intuition with distraction and noise. But every now and then, something breaks through the routine strongly enough to make a person pause. Sometimes it happens through grief, sometimes through loneliness, and sometimes through the steady, unbroken stare of a wild creature that seems to recognize something in you before you fully recognize it yourself. Maybe that is why experiences like this stay with people for years. Not because they prove anything supernatural with certainty, but because they remind us that the world may be far more emotionally connected than we have been taught to believe. Thank you for staying until the end of this story. If moments like these have ever happened to you too, subscribe before you leave, because there are still so many quiet mysteries surrounding the natural world that most people pass by without ever truly seeing. And somewhere outside, tonight, beneath a streetlight or resting silently on a fence line at the edge of someone's yard, another crow may already be watching someone stand still long enough to finally hear the part of themselves they have ignored for far too long. Maybe it was only a bird, but it never felt like only a bird.